Yes, dear Edgar, dear Juan Carlos, thank you very much for the nice introduction. And from my Latin, I could understand a little bit of the Spanish. Well, this topic that I'm going to speak about now, the stem cells, I think we really can be proud as obstetricians, gynecologists, that the last year Nobel Prize, as you all know, went to this gentleman, Bob Edwards, and he was the one who really gave us an access to stem cells. And I thought that before I speak about the cord blood, that I say something about the stem cells in general. Now, where do I... here. So this is the stages of stem cells that we routinely see nowadays because of Bob Edwards when we do in vitro fertilization. We see the stage up to the day 3 where we finally have 8 cells. And remember, at this stage, all of these cells are still what we call totipotent. That means they can do everything. They can, if you take one away, the other 7 can still go on, and out of the single one, a whole new development can originate. This is day 3. This is 2 days later, day 5, and a quite amazing differentiation has happened in the way that most cells move to the outside. They become trophoblast cells, later placenta, but these here in the so-called inner cell mass, these are the next type of stem cells. These are these so-called embryonal stem cells, which are pluripotent. They can still give rise to the different 3 germ layers, but they cannot become whole individuals. So this is only up to day 3, and then there is the next stage, day 5. The differentiation then goes on. So in the fetal age, the stem cells are all committed. They are no longer pluripotent. Once this stage is away, then only in the germ layer there are a few left, but everywhere else these stem cells are committed. And we as adults, as you know, we only have stem cells left that can do very specific tasks like producing blood. So what I want to talk about today is what we can do with cord blood stem cells, what we can expect in the future. We just reviewed this for the New York Academy of Science. But before I do that, let me quickly address the issues that we have with the earlier stages. You might be interested to hear that in Germany, it is not allowed to remove a cell at the early stage, a totipotent cell, and therefore pre-implantation genetics in Germany is not allowed. I don't know about Colombia, but maybe it's the same. Some people say because a whole embryo can develop from this cell, it cannot be touched. So we are not able to make diagnosis of chromosomal abnormalities by using FISH or by using PCR to diagnose any Mendelian disorder. And I think the reason why this is not allowed in Germany is that people think this is too much of a selection early before even the implantation has occurred. They are afraid that this will lead to the dams breaking. But then, in many other countries of Europe, like France, UK, and so on, this is allowed. And it just shows you how different Germany is from other countries and what the variety is in Europe. Now, the next stage that I mentioned, the embryonal stem cells, they are, of course, also a matter of big debate. The hope here is that they can be removed, and then in certain culture conditions, you can lead them to differentiate into any type of tissue you want, to become nerve cells or to become cardiac cells. And then this is very impressive to see in the Petri dish how these cells then start to contract. And the hope is that eventually they could be used to replace, let's say, after a myocardial infarction, the area of the heart, or after a neurodegenerative disease like Parkinson, some lost cells. But I caution you that this is a hope. And when Bob Edwards in 1978 announced that Louise Brown was born, first baby after in vitro fertilization, he had done research for 20 years, and some people had said he should stop the research. This would never give a result. And I think we are in the same stage with embryonal stem cells. We don't know whether it will ever be able to replace any organs. But maybe it will, and if we don't do the research, then we will certainly never achieve it. And so I'm very much in favor of the research. The problem, however, is that if you remove cells from the inner cell mass, and if you then want to use the cells for transplantation, they are foreign cells. They will be rejected. So the other technique that came about that would circumvent this problem would be to remove the nucleus and put in a nucleus from the potential donor. And as you know, this technique was successful for the first time in 1997. Dolly originated from a cell that was taken away from her mother, and this was a nuclear transfer. And this cloning that was achieved in Dolly is now possible in many different species. It's possible in mice, in cows, in pork, and so on. And there was even somebody, this is Wong from South Korea, from Seoul. He had cloned for the first time a dog. He was saying that this also works in humans. So he was a big star in the arena of stem cell research. But unfortunately, he had faked the results. So this cell, for example, was used 2 times in different magnifications. It was just very sad. He then had to admit publicly that this was not achieved in humans yet. And so this fraud, I think, really did a bad service to the area of stem cell research. I personally, however, think that the research still has to go on. We have to draw lines. We have to say what shouldn't be allowed. I think that, for example, the reproductive cloning should not be allowed in humans. But there is a very exciting development happening now, and this is the so-called reprogramming of adult cells. Yamanaka in Japan was the first to do that. And this is using certain genes, OCT4 and others. And with this technology, you are able to put cells back into the stage like embryonal stem cells. So this is one from Münster, where I was previously. This used to be a fibroblast cell. It has been reprogrammed, and now it's pluripotent. There are some problems that still need to be solved. There is an increased risk of mutations. There might be the formation of teratomas and so on. But if this finally succeeds, then we wouldn't need embryonal stem cells anymore, because the reprogrammed cells ideally could do the same. So this is fascinating research going on at the moment, and I think stem cells therefore have reached a stage where the whole development of in vitro fertilization was shortly before 1978. So I have spoken about these, the totipotent cells. I have mentioned the issue with preimplantation genetics. I've spoken about the pluripotent cells and the ethical problems there to use embryonal stem cells. Now we want to talk about these stem cells that we still all have that work every minute and every second in our body, producing red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. They are in our bone marrow. And as you know, these stem cells from bone marrow now can be used for treating certain diseases, especially leukemias. And for this also a Nobel Prize was awarded to Thomas. Thomas from Seattle, he received the prize in 1990 rightfully so, because see what happened after this technology was introduced. These are just data from Europe, a 10-year period. And you see that the number of transplantations, let's say for leukemia, is now 4,000 to 5,000 every year, because often it's the last resort for patients with leukemias, lymphomas, who have been treated with chemotherapy before. And it's quite fascinating to see that the demand is increasing to a degree where there are not enough bone marrow donors. In Europe, only 40% of those who would need it find a bone marrow donor, and therefore I think it was fascinating that in 1989 a hypothesis was raised in Nature that maybe in cord blood there are stem cells that are equally good as those in the bone marrow. And while this was published, there was already in the New England Journal the first case by the group of Elian Gluckman and others, and they had treated a child with Fanconi anemia successfully using cord blood stem cells, no longer bone marrow. And this child is no longer a child, is a teenager, a young adult. He's still alive. He never developed the problems of Fanconi anemia. So this is a fantastic success story that this first case worked so well. And if something works so well, less than 10 years later, there were already 500 transplantations from cord blood rather than bone marrow. Less than 5 years later, more than 1,000 transplantations from cord blood. This was spreading fast. We started a bank, a cord blood bank in Basel, Switzerland in 1997. Every year the number of cases was increasing. We could do only 200 a year, but see already in 2007 we had passed this number. And the reason why the demand is so high is clear. There are no longer only leukemias and lymphomas that you can treat, because nowadays you can even treat some genetic diseases, metabolic defects, mucopolysaccharidosis, for example, Swingit storage diseases, where otherwise the child would die already early in infancy. If they are transplanted early enough and everything works well, the new cell line will replace the enzyme that is missing due to their genetic defect. And this is where the obstetricians now come in. We can make use of the residual blood after a delivery in the placenta and in the cord. It's straightforward. We sample the blood, we put it in a bag, we do a few tests, for example, to test the chronicity. We then freeze them, ultimately to minus 195 degrees, and then these samples are stored for a potential recipient. Now, there are so many cases that we can compare complication rates between, let's say, bone marrow transplanted patients and those who got the transplant from cord blood. And you see, this is one of the complications of a transplantation that we are all afraid of. This is the so-called chronic graft versus host. You see the skin changes here. And you see this occurs in about 18% of the cases with bone marrow, and in less cases even with cord blood. So nowadays, with all the experience, we can say that cord blood is as good as bone marrow. And we didn't know that when this started in the 90s. And there are all kinds of other advantages to using cord blood. Of course, you can use every delivery. You will have the rare haplotypes because the children genetically are related to their parents. So we will have samples even for ethnic minorities. We can sample without an anesthesia. There's no risk to the donor. And so there are all kinds of advantages. There is even the ability to get away with some more mismatches because these cells are more immature. So if this list of advantages is so long, there must be disadvantages as well. And I show you what the main disadvantage is. The main disadvantage is the volume. So on average, we get like 50 to 70 cc of blood from the placenta after delivery. And this is enough for a child, it's enough for an adult, but if it's a very big adult, and if it's less, let's say, than 50, then you might have a problem and you cannot repeat it. You can do it only once. So it requires some experience, the sampling. And what is not possible yet is to expand these cells, to put them in culture and to grow more out of them. So we have tried it. We have used cocktails with EPO, with thrombopoietin and stem cell factors and so on. But what usually happens is that even if these cultures grow, they break down. So disregarding of what some companies tell you, it's not possible yet to expand the cord blood hematopoietic stem cells. But in summary, I think it's fantastic. There are a lot of samples banked. There have been all kinds of transplantations. And, if you compare what we have done with the cord blood in the past, I always like this picture. This is from the medieval times. And there was a sketch that shows a woman who has just given birth to this child. The child takes a bath here. The midwife is celebrating with the husband. They drink wine. And look here, this is the dog, and the dog takes care, eats the placenta. So I think it's fantastic that we have a much better use now for the cord blood. And you probably know this couple from Spain. So the prince and the princess, when they had their two children, what they did is they stored blood away. They stored cord blood of these two children in private banks. And the reason is that they thought that if these kids would ever need stem cells, it might be good to have some stem cells in the freezer. So this is now an interesting question. The question is this type of banking, which we should call autologous banking for your own use, is this useful, or is it good enough if we use the allogenic approach, which means we have these banks, and if a kid then, let's say in Milano, needs a sample, it might get it from Stockholm, there are these registers, the computer will find the match. Is there a place for autologous banking? And usually you find, at least in Europe, that the autologous banking is called private banking, whereas this one is called the public banking. And some people think that this is better than this because this is public. But this is by chance. It just happens that we have to pay for this, whereas here we think it's for free, but it's not for free. Because when we started our bank, for example, in Basel, Switzerland, fortunately we had a big donation from this man who you know. This is Jose Carreras. As you know, he had a transplantation. He has a leukemia. So he got transplanted successfully. So he started a big foundation. But a sample in our bank costs 2,000 Swiss francs, and we can only make it free for the women because we have this donation. So the difference is not public versus private. The difference is autologous versus allogenic. And the advantage of autologous banking is, of course, since you replace the cells in the same body, there will be no rejection. Now, if we have to decide whether it's useful, let's quickly realize that of all the transplantations, this is again European data, this is per year, 15,000 or so, are autologous ones. The majority of transplantations in born ones in people in general is autologous. Usually from the bone marrow, they are mobilized by GCSF and so on. But allogenic is also quite frequent. Now, how does autologous banking work? I'm sure you have it in Colombia as well as in Europe. The company would then give you a bag, and then in a box you send it back for your own banking, your own blood. And now we can ask, has this been successful? Well, there are only very few case reports so far, maybe 15, maybe 20, where autologous cord blood was used. This is one example. This is from a bank in Germany where this worked successfully. But it's not surprising because the kids don't need it at birth, they need it later in life. So this is a newer type of banking. We don't have so much experience. But it's very difficult to counsel patients whether it's useful. And I think this is helpful, what was done by Ken Moise and others. They have calculated if you take 200 cord samples And then you go through a few assumptions. How frequent are these diseases? In some of these diseases, in some leukemias, you could not use your own blood because the disease is already there at birth. In some others, you could. You go through the list, and eventually you can calculate how many people would profit from their own blood being banked away. And it turns out, in his early calculation, out of 200,000, only about 80 would have an additional benefit on top of the allogenic banks. So I think when we counsel parents, and if we have the ability to do allogenic banking, only a few will afford the money, like the Spanish royalty, for the autologous banking. And in a way, it's like, sometimes I say, like an earthquake insurance. This is the place I live in, Basel, the city place, and this is from an insurance company that wanted to sell me an earthquake insurance. And in the end, I think it's my private decision whether I take it or not. I asked when was the last earthquake in Basel, and it was in 1356. If I still think the risk is high, I might buy the insurance. If I think I can live with the risk, I don't want to spend the money for that purpose. But what the insurance company did, unfortunately, in this sketch, they had destroyed my house where I live. So maybe I have to reconsider my decision. But what I don't want is that anybody forces me to do this or this. I want to be counseled properly, and then I want to make my own decision. Let me finish by saying that I personally believe that there may be an additional benefit in cord blood in the long run. And this is going beyond hematopoietic stem cells. There have been some communications starting in 2001 where cord blood cells were used in certain diseases, like in this case in mice who had brain disease, and they saw some positive effect. And I personally believe that, yes, there are stem cells in cord blood beyond hematopoietic stem cells. And this belief comes from our work on non-invasive prenatal diagnosis that I will speak about later in this conference. Remember, we tried to get cells out of the maternal blood to make diagnosis of the child. And while this was happening, there was a very fascinating observation. In this endeavor to find fetal cells, what we have used often is staining the Y chromosome. So you can stain it with certain probes, fluorescence in situ hybridization, and then these white spots or green spots would indicate there is a male cell. This is a tissue after an operation done in a woman who had a thyroiditis. It looked like a Hashimoto thyroiditis, like an autoimmune disease. And then the investigators were very surprised to find that there were many cells in here that were carrying a Y chromosome. And this woman had given birth to a boy years before. And it could be proven that these cells were from the boy that she had carried in a pregnancy many years ago. So maybe these cells were resting in her bone marrow. Suddenly they came into this tissue, into the thyroid, and then they caused the trouble. So what looks like an autoimmune disease is like a graft versus host disease in her case. But the real amazing thing is that these cells all look like thyroid cells. So what they did is they differentiated into thyroid cells because of their environment. And this is the same type of pluripotency that usually is only expected from embryonal stem cells. So what this means is that these cells can only get to the mother through the cord. There is no other way, from the fetus through the placenta to the mother. And then they differentiate into different types of cells. They can show up in the skin, in the thyroid, in different organs. So what I think is that maybe there are some pluripotent cells still left in the cord blood, and therefore further research is needed. It might hopefully eventually mean that we can get around the ethical issues of embryonal stem cells. So Science magazine at that time wrote about this phenomenon called microchimerism, And they also were raising this possibility that requires further research. So let me summarize. Hematopoietic stem cells in cord blood are very established now in practice. Every obstetrician should know about it. And it's good if we are able to store away these cells for future use. I think the research on the other type of stem cells, the pluripotent ones, is very important. But we know of the problems with embryonal stem cells, and maybe cord blood can even help in this area. But coming back to Bob Edwards, who I've shown in the beginning, without the research, there will never be the progress. Thank you very much.